Imagine a society with great power, but great oppression. A place where every conversation is recorded by cameras. There's no liberty, no personal choice, and even personal thoughts are not secret. History's erased, and the government is all that has been and all that ever will be. Citizens are fed, clothed, and nationally secure, but they have no freedom. This is George Orwell's 1984. Here, Big Brother comes to life in the most horrifically realistic way. Today's debate stems from the ideals in Orwell's novel, an individual's right versus the interest of the collective. Because I believe the first step to government corruption starts with the subtle degradation of our liberties, I stand resolved. When in conflict, the right to individual privacy is more important than national security. Let's deal with a couple definitions before moving to contentions. Definition 1 is privacy. Quote, the right to be free from secret surveillance and to determine whether, when, and how, and to whom one's personal or organizational information is to be revealed. In specific, privacy may be divided into 4 categories. 1, physical. 2, informational. 3, decisional. And 4, dispositional. Definition 2 is national security as a phrase. Quote, a collective term for the defense and foreign relations of a country, protection of the interests of a country. The first definition was from the businessdictionary.com and the second from Macmillan. Now let's get into the meat of the debate by first defining a value. What should you use as your guiding light to determine between national security and privacy? I argue that value should be individual choice, which means giving people self-determination in the area of their person and privacy. There are 2 reasons to prefer this. The first is successful nations champion the individual. Democracies, republics, and constitutional democracies often place personal freedom at the pedestal of utmost importance. When they do, societies thrive because citizens have a voice. In contrast, reason to prefer 2, failed states undermine the individual. Taking away individual rights like privacy is a trademark of depraved, imperialistic, and abusive nations. China enacted a population control, one-child policy in the name of security and preservation. For years, it violated the privacy of a woman, dictating how many children she could have. When the law was disregarded, couples were fined and countless women were brutally sterilized against their will. Thousands of women in Czechoslovakia had even worse consequences. When a nation disregards individual choice, society suffers. I have 2 contentions. Contention 1, privacy protects the individual from abuse. When citizens are allowed to live freely under law, rather than being shackled by government abuse, society then exists for the people and by the people. Freedom, personal choice, empowers the individual, the building block of the people. Sadly, privacy is under siege. When the government steps over the boundaries of law, privacy is trampled under the interests of the collective. This is prevalent in the history in Spain. Up until 1975, Spain was a dictatorship. Its last tyrant was Francisco Franco. During his rule, he imprisoned his own people, set up networks of spies, and conducted mass surveillance attempting to ensure the survival of his nation. These installments enabled him to kill over 100,000 Spaniards. Following Francisco's death, the people revolted in a quest for civil rights, and they set up a constitution that made privacy the priority. The new system of government valued the people's personal choice and liberties foremost, and as a result, Spain is thriving. When there's privacy, the individual is protected and we retain consent. But now national security's intrusive measures like DNA databases, these are cornering us into giving up our liberties. The contrast today is between choice and force. If we fail to protect the individual, we lose our freedom and our dignity. Contention 2, national security degrades the individual. Choosing security over privacy gives the government a blank check to protect us in any way that they see best. However, when the government is enabled this way through national security to take away rights like privacy, then freedom, dignity, and choice are lost. Application A, past precedents. During World War II, national security targeted specific U.S. citizens that it viewed as a threat to society. It disregarded privacy out of fear. 2 months after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, ordering all Japanese Americans to evacuate the West Coast. This resulted in the relocation of approximately 120,000 people to one of 10 internment camps located across the country. The relocation of Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II was one of the most flagrant violations of civil liberties in American history. This quotation was from some source that I can't find here, history.com. After being forced to sell their property, the people were divided into camps, which resembled the camps for Jews in Germany. Barbed wire fences, armed guards on watch, minimal rations, strict curfew, and sleeping barracks. This was the life of American citizens for years. All because national security determined their Japanese ethnicity made them unsafe. Citizens were stripped of their privacy and robbed of their liberty. Application B, current methods. It's not just one circumstance. Today's NSA collection of metadata is a prime example. The ACLU found that, quote, the FBI can secretly conduct a physical search or wiretap on American citizens to obtain evidence of crime without proving probable cause, as the Fourth Amendment explicitly requires, close quote. In actuality, many international organizations like the UN have spoken out against this. National security is capable of great things, but it's prone to become a resort to tyranny. History has proven this. In order to prevent a scenario mirroring 1984, the government should value individual choice, and that means putting privacy highest. Because if we empower it to overstep the law in one situation, it has the means to take power in every situation. Put the power in the hands of the individual.
I just have a couple questions about your last speech. First of all, would you agree that stability is foundational to a nation?
I agree.
Okay, great. Can a nation thrive without first being stable?
There are degrees of stability. So the basic degree of not having chaos and violent death surrounding us, you can't be free without that. But that doesn't mean all forms of stability.
Okay, you would agree that something like a terrorist attack can shake the stability of our nation.
Correct, but it doesn't end the nation.
Right, but you would agree that it greatly endangers the citizens of a nation.
Certainly.
Okay, great. Should we not stop these tragedies if we have the capability to do so?
We should stop them in the right way.
Okay, what way is that?
That is by balancing all a government's and nation's priorities, such as individual liberty.
Okay, you would agree that in some circumstances that some limitation on privacy is necessary when moments and lives are on the line.
Yes.
Okay, great. Do our priorities change in conflict?
As a nation?
In a moment of crisis, do the priorities that we have in general on a daily basis, do they change when we're looking at a crisis?
Of course.
Okay, great. Now, how do you determine what should be prioritized in conflict?
It's a whole mix of things. So I guess you get a bunch of wise advisors together, balance the different priorities.
Okay, how quickly do terrorist attacks happen? Do they happen in a matter of days, weeks, or do they happen in a matter of minutes?
They're planned over a matter of months, sometimes years, and the final trigger, once the trigger is pulled, of course, that's the signal.
Okay, great. So you would agree that in a moment of crisis, if it happens within a couple minutes or even within a amount of time like an hour, there's not necessarily time to consult a judge for something on that matter.
I would agree with that.
Okay, great. Now, how many U.S. citizens are there?
Around 320 million?
Okay, so which is more important, the protection of 300 million people or the value of one person's right to privacy?
The protection of 300 million people from violent death.
Okay, you would agree that one person's privacy in a moment of conflict and prioritizing that privacy can endanger millions of citizens, correct?
Theoretically, it can, of course.
Okay, great. Now, if a citizen is acting and is plotting an act of terror, should the government be allowed to violate his privacy?
We have safeguards built up, such as probable cause and other intricacies of Fourth Amendment case law that help make that determination.
Something like probable cause, for instance, you would agree that actually requires a warrant, correct?
No, probable cause does not absolutely require a warrant.
Okay, in a lawful stance, you would say that there needs to be a court order or a warrant to be able to forcibly arrest someone, correct?
Unless there are expedient circumstances, yes.
Great, no further questions. It was a peaceful Sunday morning this past Easter when a strange man entered a church building. As he made his way to the sanctuary, a bystander noticed something suspicious. There was a quick-draw pistol protruding from his belt. After receiving the tip, security stopped the man before he could enter the crowd. When the man refused to relinquish his gun, they took it, then forcibly searched his backpack. Inside was an assault rifle, various guns, and enough ammunition to obliterate everyone on the premises. He took off running, but was caught and arrested. Had security not intercepted his plans, he would have put the lives of 3,500 people at risk. And I might not be here to this day, because that day, I was there. Today I stand resolved that when in conflict, the right to individual privacy is not as important as national security. What I'm going to be doing in this speech is first looking at 3 key ideas and then addressing my opponent's piece. So first of all, let's look at the value. My value in today's debate is that of protection of human rights, and I'll show why this is superior to my opponent's value a little bit later in this speech. But first, let's look at a key idea in this resolution. The resolution requires that we debate situations of conflict. I agree with my opponent that privacy is more important than national security. There, I said it. But that's not the debate. This debate is not about which is more valuable alone, but which ought to be prioritized when the two conflict. There is a logical chasm between the general importance of privacy and holding tightly to that privacy's importance in a moment of crisis. This scenario of emergency is what civil rights expert and U.S. Judge Posner writes about in his book, Not a Suicide Pact: The Constitution in a Time of National Crisis. Today, I'll prove that in a moment of crisis, we should temporarily hold national security as more important. I have but one key thesis. National security trumps privacy and conflict. National security trumps privacy and conflict. Let's look at 3 key ideas. 1. Privacy's price is too high. 1. Privacy's price is too high. 1 week after 9/11, America faced what is known as the anthrax attacks. The deadly pathogen Bacillus anthrax, or anthrax, was placed in the mail and sent to senators and news agencies. The virus killed 5 people and critically infected 17 others, leading to what's been labeled as the FBI as, quote, one of the largest and most complex investigations in the history of law enforcement, end quotes. The Postal Service and law enforcement officers acted rapidly to halt and search people's mail, which is normally considered an illegal violation of privacy. The years that followed led to a lawsuit for government infringement of privacy and the creation of legislation that allowed mail officials to go through mail with reasonable suspicion of dangerous content. We held that the government should be able to open letters that show signs of biological or chemical warfare because it takes temporary precedence over the privacy of an individual's mail. In times of crisis, we need men and women in uniform, not suits toting briefcases. If Ebola-laced letters were discovered this morning in the Oklahoma City post office, would you want mail to continue to be delivered until a mail or a judge decides that it's okay to pause and search the mail? Anthrax is not an isolated event. There is a thread of terrorist attacks, from the Mumbai bombings in 2008 to San Bernardino to the Boston bombings and the ISIS attack in Belgium. In the past 10 days, there have been over 10 terrorist attacks in Turkey, Africa, and the Middle East. Today, our nation is still mourning from the biggest mass shooting in U.S. history, the Orlando shooting, where 50 people died. When national security is devalued, this is the impact. Lives that are lost can never be gained back. Point 2. In the moment, not the aftermath. Point 2. In the moment, not the aftermath. It's too easy to answer the privacy versus national security debate by looking backwards. In fact, many of my opponent's examples, including that of Spain or even that of the Japanese internment camp, suffer from this hindsight. But the choice is far less clear in the moment of crisis. At my church, what could have been the next San Bernardino was successfully thwarted. When in a moment of crisis, normal security officers are faced with this question. Should we deprive a citizen a sliver of their privacy or potentially allow hundreds of people to die? Law enforcement officers and military have to decide what to do before they know the full nature of the threat or have time to ask a judge's opinion. The legal term for this is exigent circumstances, which in constitutional law empowers officials to make their own decision to override rights without a warrant in a crisis moment due to the urgency of the situation. We often give the men and women who protect us the benefit of the doubt in these scenarios. It's pretty universal, as we can see when we look at global expressions of privacy in point 3. Privacy has a momentary exception. Point 3. Privacy has a momentary exception. Globally, privacy is respected as a right, yet the same nations that recognize it as a right allow the exception for national security. The Fourth Amendment in the U.S. Bill of Rights states that there is a reasonable way to intrude into personal matters, as is in the clause of search and seizure. Even the EU's Human Rights Articles has a section on privacy which provides the exception of national security. And lastly, the UN's 1950 Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms confirms that there's an exception for national security. Here's the impact. Everywhere that national security or even privacy is deemed as a right, there is an exception, and that exception is national security. Now, I want to look at a couple points in my opponent's case. First, let's look at the value, and I have two responses to this. First is no personal choice if life is threatened. My first response to his value is that no personal choice can be given if life is threatened. I would agree that essentially individual choice is great. We should have the ability to choose what we want in our lives. But on a day-to-day basis, that's the choice that we're making. We're not looking at a day-to-day basis. We're looking at a moment of crisis and a moment of conflict. And if your life is on the line and there's a trigger to your face and you don't have the ability to secure your individual rights or even your freedom in the long run, you have to choose that which protects your life in the moment. And that's what national security does. Secondly, to his value, my second response is that privacy can't stop the trigger. Privacy can't stop the trigger. If I can prove in today's debate that national security is the only way that can protect these rights, such as individual privacy or even that of individual choice in conflict, then I should win the value in today's debate. Essentially, privacy cannot stop the trigger in a moment of crisis. My second response to his piece is that a moment of conflict. We're looking at conflict not a day-to-day basis, and this will be a huge point in today's speech and throughout the debate. Thirdly, short-term limitation for long-term preservation. Short-term limitation for long-term preservation, and this is a response to his first contention. Essentially, we're limiting something very shortly in the moment when there is a crisis. We're not eliminating it altogether. Fourth and finally, hurting people does not equal protecting people. Hurting people does not equal protecting people. First, Spain dictatorship was actually a result of a corrupt dictator. Secondly, the internment camps was not in the interest of national security. And third and finally, wiretaps have actually prevented terrorist attacks from happening. It's for all these reasons we can clearly see that national security ought to be prioritized in conflict.
Okay, I have two major lines of questions for you. Let's see how far we get. The first one has to do with the phrase how far and limits. What I want to know is, in a moment of crisis, when did the crisis start?
That's a very tricky question, because a lot of the times we can't necessarily say that a terrorist doesn't have a right to privacy or that we're just limiting one person's right. We're looking at a moment of conflict when someone who walks in with a gun is immediately a threat. When that person deems themselves a threat to a society or in a scenario, that person automatically should have their right to privacy violated.
Okay.
That's a circumstance that we can look at.
So we can agree that the moment that the person walked into the church with the guns, at that point it was a moment of crisis, right?
Yes, as soon as a person is deemed a threat and can endanger the lives of people.
Let's back up the timeline a little bit to find when it's not. Okay, so what about when they walked from the car to the church building? Was that part of the moment of crisis when they had the intent to go in there and blow things up?
Essentially, yes. I mean, you can look at the simple
and then let's back up further than that. When they were making the plans and they were in their apartment and they were, I don't know, assembling the ammo and looking up the church specs or who knows what they were doing. But they were somehow planning this attack because they had all that stuff. So was that part of the moment of crisis?
It is. When a person has an intention to be able to harm other people,
so let's back that up even further. So they have an intention and they're at a gun store now. So this is when the guy first bought the gun. Is that part of the moment of crisis?
You know, that's a blurry line because we're looking at someone who has the intention of purchasing a gun. I guess you could say officially when they purchase that gun or purchase the ropes or whatever they purchase to be able to
without privacy, like if the law enforcement were able to look at that person's internet history and plans and stuff, they might have been able to figure out, oh my goodness, this is what this guy is planning. Can we agree on that?
That's a large hunch. That happens sometimes. We're looking at a circumstance where someone's walking into a building and
But
immediately the
like,
decision
let's
has to
say
be
the
made.
case of 9/11, where you've got 19 people and it's a highly coordinated effort, spanning the globe. Likely,
Sure.
there are all kinds of plans and coordinating activities that happen far before the crisis itself, correct?
Right, and there are definitely limitations that are set up to be able to prevent those terrorist attacks from happening. The NSA has already stopped 34 specific terrorist attacks because of wiretapping.
Right.
But
And so
obviously,
my
there's not.
question is, I understand that, but when you say that you agree with my position, except in a moment of crisis, I'm trying to figure out when there is not a moment of crisis.
The reason why I don't agree with your side is because you're not looking at a moment of conflict. You're looking at a day-to-day basis where a person is making a choice. But the resolution states when in conflict, not when after conflict or when before conflict, when in conflict. And that's why there's a blurry line. And the question is happening in a moment of crisis,
Okay.
not when there's not a crisis going on.
Last question for you. Would you agree with me that we should look towards the long-term result of this resolution, not just the short term?
Exactly, which is why my second contention was short-term limitation for long-term preservation. You can't have your life if it's not protected in a moment of crisis.
Thank you. The United States has an official office called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Here's what CNN said about them in 2015. Quote, "The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board released an extensive report and found that bulk collection of America's phone call metadata was not effective in identifying terrorist plots or terrorists," close quote. Do you think that the NSA doesn't believe it's acting out of crisis? I would argue that the NSA does, for the exact reason that Mikayla answered my cross-examination with, well, I guess there's a little bit of a blurry area. It is in the blurry area that your privacy and liberties are destroyed as your country turns from successful individual pricing state to failed state. Let's take a look at the arguments by starting with my opponents, and then we'll look at my case. First of all, she tried to hook you in with the quick draw church example, which sounds frightful. But she admitted in cross-examination this debate is about the long-term effects of prioritizing privacy versus national security, not any one particular example. And that's huge because my opponent dropped both reasons to prefer my value of individual choice, which were about national success and failed states in the long run. So while I can agree with her that scary things happen, the scarier thing is for your nation to turn into a failed state as a result of a series of small, short-term decisions that sacrifice liberties. Sometimes we're going to have to take a little pain. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop the church guy, but it does mean we need a limit on the moment of crisis. Second, she said, well, which is prioritized in a moment of crisis? Because she agreed. I have several responses. The first is moments have buildups. Let's take 9/11, for example. 9/11 actually started in 1986. In the Russia-Afghan War, the United States supported the Mujahideen against Russia. One soldier in the Mujahideen was named Osama bin Laden. We gave them guns, ammo, training, and CIA agents. And then, when the war was over and their country was in ruins, we kind of just left them and hung them out to dry. And at that moment, they decided the United States was a great Satan. And they resolved to come blow us up. And we surveilled them and knew that, and that's why in 1998, President Clinton authorized missile strikes to try and blow up Osama bin Laden. Now, is that surprising to you? Well, it's because in 1993, Osama bin Laden tried to blow up the World Trade Centers the first time. So then we shot back, and then it kept going, and then in 9/11, we all know what happened then. My point is that the moment of crisis wasn't when the first plane was hijacked. The moment could conceivably have been the entire 20-year history leading up to it. Second, don't fall into the case-by-case trap. That's the crux. Should you operate by principle or by case-by-case basis? My opponent says on a case-by-case basis, but that leads to what George Washington calls a web of entanglement. It's why we supported Iran before we supported Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war, before we had to fight Iraq, because we made a series of short-term moment of crisis decisions, and we shouldn't do that. We should operate by principle. Lastly, she argues privacy's price is too high and points to the anthrax attacks, but I say the opposite. Limitless suspension is too high. There's always a moment of crisis because there's always a buildup. Somewhere, there's a constant state of fear the government can conjure up. And if we're able to say it's a moment of crisis when dangerous stuff is likely to happen, then we link to my case, which is still true, that failed states make the types of decisions my opponent advocates, and successful ones resist them.
Let's go ahead and begin. In 2006, 7 men who were a part of an extremist cult had plans and materials to set off a bomb in the middle of the Sears Tower. This is known as Liberty City 7. If the privacy of these men had not been violated by the FBI sting operation, hundreds of people would have died and many more would have been injured. The question is, would you rather be one of the people killed by a successful bomb attempt, or would you be one of the people that had to empty their pockets and walk through a metal detector before entering a building? The answer is obvious. We'd rather lose a little privacy than our life. In today's speech, we're looking at moments of conflict, and the majority of the time that we look at moments of conflict, they are moments of crisis, moments of emergency. And I can agree with my opponent that we'll be looking at history, but the fact is we can't look in today's to be when after conflict or when before conflict, but the resolution explicitly states when in conflict. And with that lens and looking at the resolution, I want to look specifically at the moments of crisis, situations like what happened in San Bernardino, situations like what happened in Liberty City 7. So let's look at 4 key ideas in this very final speech and look at why, when in conflict, national security ought to be valued higher. First is that of the value. Let's look over the value. And I said in his last speech that I essentially dropped both of his ideas, but I would state that I'm not going to specifically go and refute them right now, but I want to show you while my reasons to prefer are actually superior to that of my opponent's value. I actually give a very important reason to prefer my last speech. I said privacy can't stop the trigger. My opponent didn't respond to this. And because of this main reason, I should win the value. But here's why this one reason to prefer my value is superior. Because when we're looking at a moment of crisis, the reason why national security must be preferred is because it best protects human rights. In a moment of conflict, national security is the only measure that can take the gun out of the gunman's hand and stop a mass shooting. It can stop the ability of a gunman to end someone's life. It can stop the ability of them to go and blow up a whole bunch of people. That ability in a moment of crisis is vital, and privacy cannot stop the trigger. It does not have the ability to, in the long run, preserve individual choice. I would agree that on a day-to-day basis, this is important. We must have this. But if you lose your life in a moment of crisis, there's no way you can have individual choice because you first didn't value your ability to be protected. And national security best protects rights, is the only ability that can take the gun out of the hand of the gunman. And that's why the value in today's debate is best met by national security. Now, the second thing under the value I want to point out is that of the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy. In his last point, he talked about this whole idea throughout really his entire case about situations like 1984 and this example and the fact that when we limit rights, we'll lose them altogether. But I want to point out the fact that this is a slippery slope fallacy. Just because we're limiting rights in one instance does not mean we're losing them altogether. Let me show you how this works. For instance, during the history of the United States, during World War II, World War I, and during a time of national crisis, when we were literally in war, we had some of the highest restrictions on the press and on individual rights than most other citizens during that time. But after the wartime passed, the United States lifted the restrictions and people gained their rights back. Here's the impact. When rights are limited, they can be gained back. But this leads us into the second point of today's speech. Rights can be given back, but lives can't. My second point, rights can be given back, but lives can't. The fact is, when we look at that history of the US, we're looking at a primary example where rights were limited, but rights were given back. The second point under this idea, you can tag this as B, which is debate about preservation, not principle. Debate about preservation, not principle. My opponent is essentially saying that when you vote for the affirmative, you're voting for the vote of principle. You're standing on the ground of what you believe in, patriotism, individual rights, all that great stuff. I am an American citizen, and I value my privacy, and I value my freedom, and I stand on principle in today's debate. But the fact is, we're not looking at principle. We're looking at the idea of how we can protect those rights that other citizens laid their lives down to protect. People lay down their lives all the time to be able to preserve our freedoms, our soldiers, people who fight in the military. It's about preserving those rights. It's not about principle. My third point in today's speech is that of exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances. We're looking at a situation that is a lawful term through constitutional law, which allows the exception for national security. And in fact, when we look at moments of crisis, there's a legal term for this. It's called exigent circumstances. And this was actually affirmed in the case of People versus Riddle. And they explained exigent circumstances in this way, quote, when an emergency circumstance exists, constitutional requirements such as the need for a warrant may be excused because of overriding necessity. Here's the impact. When there is a moment of conflict, because of exigent circumstances, you don't have time to consult a judge, you don't have time to go out and get a warrant, but there's a lawful procedure called exigent circumstances, which deems that when there is a necessary moment to be able to preserve life, there can be certain rights that are overridden, and this is exigent circumstances. My fourth and final point is that of terrorism is the greatest threat to individual rights. Terrorism is the greatest threat to individual rights. If we look at Judge Richard A. Posner's book, he talks about the greatest threat to human rights. And he says, we often neglect to realize a genuine lesson of history that the greatest danger to American civil liberties will be another terrorist attack on the United States. When we allow terrorism not to be stopped, when we don't prioritize national security, people who are terrorists will continue to haunt our liberties. They will continue to pursue our nation and try to take them down. The fact is, when we look at the fifth and final issue of the dropped arguments, we can see that the EU, the UN, and the US Constitution have guaranteed the right to privacy. But in today's debate, those three international bodies have actually deemed that there is an exception, and the exception is national security. For all these reasons, we can see that there's no way to preserve privacy in the long run unless we value national security, the ability to protect it in the short run, to enjoy it in the long run.
It was the Apostle Paul who said, "Walk by faith, not by sight." It is so easy in a moment of crisis to sacrifice your principles for what seems frightening. But I have a simple question for you. Are we in a moment of crisis right now? The global war on terrorism was started with the authorization for the use of military force right after September 11th of 2000. It has not been repealed. We are in a war against terrorists. That's a moment of crisis, just like the entirety of World War II is a moment of crisis. My opponent wants to distract you with particulars of single events as if those are the moments of crisis. But it's a bigger picture than that. And my opponent has failed to see the bigger picture. I have a few points. Point 1, failed test. My opponent and I have agreed on the value in the round today. Individual choice, self-determination. At no point has my opponent attempted to impact her arguments back to individual choice. She isn't showing you that in a moment of crisis, prioritizing national security over privacy helps your individual choice. She fails the test we agreed to. Second, failed states. The nature of privacy is what my opponent seems to disregard. Privacy is degraded in tiny, small fragments. We saw from my definition, it has 4 subparts. It's the kind of thing that's degraded over a long period of time. National security happens usually in massive, rare events that you can look at. My opponent has simply stated the obvious. Massive events seem big, and privacy seems small when you're looking at something big. But I say smooth all that out and compare it to each other over the long term. And we agreed to that in cross-examination. Over the long term, my opponent's viewpoint leads to failed states. And my viewpoint leads to successful states. Third, failed crisis. In a moment of crisis, we still don't give unlimited power. My opponent points to exigent circumstances, but I say turn this back against her. The fact that we've come up with as complex a doctrine as exigent circumstances, which has all kinds of rules and specific balances, balancing privacy and security, proves that even in the most bizarre and unforeseeable crisis, even the lawyers think we've got to keep some privacy above security. You can't strip everybody naked and do whatever you want to solve the crime. And that's a protection of your liberty, because in some failed states, they do those sorts of things. So what's the default? Default privacy on. In a moment of crisis, privacy is still on. So privacy is more important than national security.